The projector starts, and so begins this episode of Movie Nights and Matinees, the podcast for people who enjoy movies from when we actually had to go to the movies. I'm your host, Bill Groves, and this is episode 32, all about WB. No, the other one, in which my guest and I look at the life and career of an Oscar-winning actor whom relatively few people remember. So make yourself comfortable as we go back to the silent era and work our way forward while discussing the other WB.
Start right at the beginning. What's your name?
My name is... I can't think. My head. I can't remember. I don't know. I don't know who I am.
Hi, everybody. Thanks for listening. You know, if you ask the average moviegoer what the initials WB mean to them, they'll almost certainly reference a certain major motion picture studio whose name is forever associated with the first feature incorporating synchronized dialogue, a wave of gangster pictures, and a legacy of wonderful cartoons and characters. Some people may also reference a related television network. However, the WB we're going to talk about today actually predates the aforementioned Warner Brothers in the movie business, though their careers in the industry linked up in at least one memorable production. The WB I speak of is Warner Baxter, an actor whose resume includes many noteworthy roles going back to the silent era, yet whose name doesn't tend to roll off the tongue of movie fans with the ease of many of his contemporaries. Here to talk with me about the life and career of Warner Baxter is Dan Van Neste, author of the recently published book from Bear Manor Media, The Accidental Star: The Life and Films of Warner Baxter. Dan, welcome to Movie Nights and Matinees.
Thank you very much. I appreciate the invitation. Good to be here.
Oh, glad to have you. So to begin with, why don't you introduce yourself to the listeners in terms of your background and prior books that you've written?
Well, my name is Dan Van Neste, as you said. I'm an author and a biographer. I've been writing about classic movies from the so-called golden age of the cinema and vintage filmmakers for over 30 years now. I started in the late 1980s and surprisingly began to get published pretty quickly. I remember one of my first magazine deals was doing an article for a magazine called Big Reel. I don't know if you remember that.
I
but
do.
Anyway, it's defunct now. But anyway.
That was a source of like 8 millimeter and 16 millimeter collectors.
Yeah, and it was a wonderful resource that, again, I had no idea. I love classic movies. I've been writing all my life, but I love classic movies. But I really didn't start writing about them until the late 1980s. And that was they were asking for articles and things like that. And so I provided a couple. But I probably gained some notoriety for writing articles in the 90s for the Classic Film Monthly, Classic Images, and its sister quarterly, Films of the Golden Age. I wrote many, many articles through the years for both. I was in the first issue of Films of the Golden Age, and I'm happy to say those magazines are still being published, and they're still doing a lot of good stuff, in my opinion anyway. I didn't start writing books until 2008. And I thought to myself, I've been writing articles for over 20 years. And I thought, my dream was always to write books. And I thought, man, I'm not getting any younger. I'm going to have to start doing it if I'm ever going to do it.
Sure.
And I ended up choosing a topic that I had wanted to write about before, but I never really did. But I've always loved B-movie series. So I chose as my first book the Columbia B-movie series, The Whistler. And my book was titled the Whistler stepping into the shadows. I give you all the background, anything you've ever wanted to know about that series, and probably more that you didn't care to know. But anyway,
well,
since
actually, let me jump in and ask you about that, because that raises a question. That's a series that I intend to get to, and I actually recently picked up a DVD set of that, but it had all of them except one. I think it was Mark of the Whistler.
The Mark of the Whistler.
Does that sound right?
There's some copyright issues on that.
I wondered.
Yeah, and I don't know. I wasn't aware that wasn't part of that set, so I wasn't even aware of that. But they've never shown that on Turner Classic Movies before. But this series is so different than anything you've ever seen before. I was stunned by it when I first saw it. And it includes, the star was Richard Dix,
right?
I've always admired. Oh, he's much more versatile than you'd ever think. But I learned a lot from doing that book. I have written articles on B-movie series, including one we're going to talk about, The Crime Doctor, before. But I had, never done a book, and I thought, I'm going to breeze through this book because, I have done this, man. I know what I'm doing here. It took me 3 years to do it. And Columbia doesn't have an archive. And so I was all around the country trying to find material for that book. But I finished it. My second book was in 2017, was my first book where I did a full-fledged biography. And it was called The Magnificent Heel. And it's the story, the life and films of Ricardo Cortez. He was always one that stood out to me. He had never had a book. Nobody knew anything about him. And so that's who I chose to write about. Since I began writing about the movies, I decided from the very beginning, I wanted to tell stories that had never been told. I wanted to write about people who made significant contributions, but for one reason or another, their life and career stories had never really been told. They might not have achieved top stardom or whatever. And I've always thought, hey, listen, their stories deserve to be told. And Cortez was one of those people that always stood out. And no matter whether he was working, he made over 100 films. He worked with some of the great directors, all the great directors from in the silent era, DeMille and Griffith and the whole crowd, and in the sound era as well. Worked all with.
Well, he was the original Sam Spade.
Absolutely. Yes. That is an interesting movie that I have a lot of admiration for, even though a lot of people just completely trash it. I love the Houston version best, but it's a movie that was a very good prequel film, and it doesn't ever get the credit that it deserves. So I did that one in 2017. And then in 2019, I published a book essentially of a compilation book of my articles. And it's called They Could Have Been Contenders. And it's the story of 12 people who came to Hollywood around the same time. They achieved a level of success. They won major studio contracts. They won acclaim being in good films. But for one reason or another, they achieved a level. They were not failures, but they had never achieved that top rung of superstardom. And I go into great depth on their careers. And I was lucky enough to interview 6 of them. The interviews are some of my proudest things. They're really interesting, in my humble opinion, because they really opened up to me and talked about their lives.
Who were some of those?
Oh, gosh. The actor Edward Norris, I don't know if you know who he was. He was a B-movie actor. He appeared in the film They Won't Forget. I don't know if you're familiar with the Warner Brothers film They Won't Forget. He was the teacher who was put on trial. Anyway, he was in Boys Town. He was an MGM contract player for a time. And Queen Christina had a minor role in that. He played in 70 films. You would know him if you saw him because they're showing a lot of his films on some of these channels right now. But anyway, he gave me 13 hours of tape. He told me, he shared his entire career with me. Bless his heart, he was my pal. Anyway, Jean Parker, I don't know if you know who Jean Parker is. She was Beth in Little Women, the original with Katharine Hepburn. She was an MGM contract player too. She was in The Gunfighter with Gregory Peck. Did a lot of B movies with Richard Arlen and Chester Morris. She was a gorgeous girl who completely changed her career midway through. She played these young ingenues, and then all of a sudden, you would know her if you saw her because she made a lot of movies.
Yeah. I guess the closest interview of that type, and I don't even know you could really consider him a familiar face per se, even in that a lot of his career was stunt work, but I got an interview with X Brands.
Okay, I recognize that name.
Yeah, who was most prominently known in the TV series Yancey Derringer as Pahu Katewa, the Yancey Derringer's Indian companion.
Yeah, maybe I do remember that.
But yeah, he was an interesting interview.
I imagine. Those people are the best. I also did Karen Morley. I don't know if you know who she is. See, I'm bringing. You got to check these people out. You absolutely have to.
Yeah.
Karen Morley was in Scarface. She was the gun mall in Scarface with
Paul Muni.
Yeah,
it's been quite a while since I've seen that one, but
but she did a lot. She was MGM too.
Yeah,
they let a lot of people go.
Well, so that provides a nice introduction to how you came to Warner Baxter. Although, I mean, I guess there were undoubtedly any number of other actors who would fall into that category of not having their lives all that well documented. Yes. So how did you happen to choose Warner Baxter for your
I liked Warner Baxter when I was a kid. I saw the Crime Doctor films and I enjoyed that kind of genre. And so, again, I didn't start writing about the movies until much later, but he was kind of on a list of people I felt were really interesting that had never really gotten their due, although he achieved a level of success that some of these other people did not achieve. He was a top star of the 30s. He was not a minor player of the 30s, although he's pretty much forgotten today. But anyway, I had him on a list of people when I started writing books that were possible subjects. And then I did an article about the Crime Doctor series for Films of the Golden Age magazine. And while doing that, I did a profile of Baxter for that piece. It was very in-depth. What intrigued me most about Warner Baxter was his struggles with mental illness. And so I felt that would be a really interesting life to cover in addition to all his accomplishments.
Yeah, that's one of the ongoing themes through the book, of which there are several, which I want to get into a couple of the specific ones as we go on.
Okay.
But I'm curious, the title, The Accidental Star. I kept looking for something as I was reading the book. Okay, somewhere he's going to really zero in and there's going to be a direct connection to that, but I unless I missed it, I never
never got
zeroed
there.
In on it. Then
I have messed up in this. Anyway, let me explain to you that title because that's kind of a story in itself.
Please.
When I do a book, I care very much about the title of the book. It's in the cover art on the book. I'm really kind of obsessed with that because I think that's what attracts people to buy a book, is if there's an interesting title. And of course, the subject matter is always the most important. But anyway, I had come up with another title for this book. And anyway, as I was doing the research and as I began to write the article, I began to see this series of injuries and all of these accidents. And they were accidents that didn't always affect Baxter directly, but indirectly affected him. There are things that happened to people he knew. There were things that they were actually worked to his advantage.
Right.
he got into acting. Really, his first acting job was because somebody got hurt in vaudeville, and it kept happening. And I thought to myself, my gosh, this title is writing itself. I mean, it has to be about the accidents. I felt that throughout these things, because they kept, the brushes with death were kind of amazing. And I do think that had an impact on his psyche.
Yeah.
To be injured and have all these injuries and all these things happening to him all the time.
Including the San Francisco earthquake. I saw that he was a survivor of that.
Yes. This incredible series of these things happening to him. In The Love Charm, the very first films that he did, he was knocked out completely when a horse reared up because they put him in armor and the armor scraped the horses. Some part of their body, and they reared up and knocked him off the horse and knocked him out. And they had trouble opening up the armor. He was in a suit of armor. And all these things, the auto accident that he totaled his car as soon as he got to Hollywood. The car overturned, and it's just a miracle that they lived to see the next film. But he was in a couple aerial accidents, and it was just kind of crazy stuff.
Yeah.
So that's the reason, really.
Okay. Well, and speaking of the book, the format of the book, one thing that fascinated me is, of course, you have a very detailed biography in the front, and then about half the book really is a very detailed filmography. And I love that you incorporate not only just the basic information, but the, whether the film survives and if it's available in one format or another somewhere or a source. So yeah, you want to just kind of talk about how you laid that out?
Right. As you said, the first half of the book, it's almost half and half, it's just kind of a straight up biography. Although chapter 12, it's 12 chapters in the biography section. And chapter 12 is kind of an analytical chapter where I talk about things I learned for whatever, if you choose to accept them or not, they're things that I wanted to share. I tried to answer a few questions. Who was Warner Baxter? What was he all about? What did he do that was important? And I try to answer those questions. And why has he been forgotten? That's a big question to me. And also, what was his true legacy? And I take what I learned in the 3 years of researching the guy, and I try to share that as best I knew how. Because again, he was a very private person. So he didn't always share his innermost feelings in a lot of areas. But I did get a sense of him, and I tried to share that. Part 2 of the book is devoted to all 104 of his films. Each film has its own section, which includes all the credit information that you might expect: the cast, the director, the scriptwriter, the year, the time. And then I do include, as you said, the availability. It's a structure that I came up with while doing Ricardo Cortez. And people loved it so much, and they kept saying, we really like this film section. We refer to it all the time when we see any of these films that he did. And so, yeah, it includes a summary of the plot. Also, the films that have not survived, or the films that have survived in part or in whole that are not available on DVD, I did endeavor to tell you where they're at. So if you wanted to ever check out some of the silent, particularly the silent films in the archives, I tell you where you can find them. But I also include notable reviews, some of the more reviews concentrating on Baxter. And the last section on each one, and I think this is the most popular thing with people that talk about the books that I've done, is the trivia backstory section, where I share things that I learned in the archives about some of these movies that didn't fit in the biography section. Things like original titles, box office receipts, original cast members. There might have been people, before Baxter might have inherited some of the roles that he got, different like salaries. And then I inserted in certain films, little bios, little summary bios of some of the participants, the script writers, the editors, some of the supporting players, and things that I felt were really interesting people that nobody would probably remember otherwise. So I'm all into all these people that never get credit, because man, they did a lot. All the script writers and the editors and the cinematographers and all these wonderful people that were so talented, but they get nobody even knows who they are.
Yeah.
So,
yeah. Well, that's a very common story in Hollywood. In fact, I dare say most of the stories in Hollywood are of that type.
Right. True.
There was one thing in there that, well, there were a lot of things that I learned in your book. One took me a little bit off guard, just wasn't the kind of thing I was expecting. And that is there was a connection between Warner Baxter and my hometown of Tulsa, that one of his early acting jobs was part of a troupe,
right.
I guess a regional touring acting troupe
at that time,
based in Tulsa.
Well, he ended up in Tulsa because he got married. It was an unfortunate union, his first wife, and it was short-lived. And anyway, he was selling insurance. His family were never in favor of him being an actor. They just weren't. And they fought him for a time, but the acting won out. But anyway, they had convinced him to find other work. And at that time, and this was about 1911, he took an insurance course and he was selling life insurance. And he was in Philadelphia. He ran this office and he met this girl, and he fell in love with this young, pretty girl, and they got married, unfortunately. And she convinced him, he had been saving his money, and she convinced him to take his savings. She wanted to reunite with her brother. They were both from Canada, and she wanted to reunite with her brother. And he lived in Tulsa, Oklahoma, and he ran a garage there and an auto dealer, a Studebaker auto dealer. So Baxter, which was very unlike him, but he let her, convince him. And he left his job and went to Tulsa and invested all of his money, a sight unseen, into this business. Well, the brother was up to his neck in debt, and the money went to his creditors. And the business went belly up, and so did the marriage. Viola, his wife, she went back to Philadelphia, although they did not divorce until years later. And Baxter decided he was going to pursue his dream. And his dream was always to be an actor. And he had been in vaudeville for a short period of time, but he let his family convince him not to pursue this. He lost everything. And so he went to work for North Brothers, this touring group that went all over that area. They went into Texas, and I think they went into Oklahoma and Arkansas. So they went all over presenting these plays. And Baxter later said that it was a great learning experience. And he was with these players for about 2 years, and before he began trying his wings in Hollywood. This was between 1912 and 1914. But that was his connection to Tulsa.
Well, again, that caught my attention for obvious reasons.
Yeah, I can imagine.
Yeah. Well, the one thing, and I consider myself a pretty knowledgeable film buff, but I admit that my knowledge of his career was fairly limited. I mean, there are 3 or 4 titles that come to mind, apart from the Crime Doctor series as a whole. What I was fascinated to learn was a number of films that he was in, including some in the silent era, that we know generally from remakes. He was the original Great Gatsby in the silent era.
Isn't that something?
And unfortunately, a lost film. Also, one of my favorite comedies of the 30s, The Awful Truth.
He was in the original.
Yeah, and he was in the original silent version of that. I didn't know there was a silent version of that.
I didn't either. Got to tell you, I was not aware. There has been 4 versions of that. And the one that we all love, the Cary Grant, Irene Dunn one, was the 3rd one. There was actually a one in between, which I wasn't aware of. So he was the original in that.
Yeah, and then he starred in. Now I know there's a silent version of this one with Mary Pickford, Daddy Longlegs. My wife Debbie's one of her favorite films is the Fred Astaire version of that musical. I wasn't aware that there was a 1931 with Warner Baxter.
Right.
Poor kids.
What do you mean, Jervis? You can't bring them up in batches of 100 like chickens in an incubator. It isn't natural.
That's why I wanted you to come here and see for yourself. Oh, I hate to be always begging, but there's one of this batch I'd like to single out and educate.
Who is it?
It's a she.
A girl? What, are you trying to compromise me?
A pretty one.
That's worse. I suppose she's got a good record.
She has the worst record of any child in this home.
She sounds dangerous. I'm scared.
She never lies to save herself, but she's disobedient and impudent.
What do you expect me to do, reform her?
Send her to college. Her teachers say she could make her mark if she had the training.
Now, I hate women who make their mark. Besides, I don't like young girls.
You're a confirmed bachelor and prejudiced.
Prejudice?
Against girls. You've really never known any.
Perhaps I've known too many.
And that's actually, as I was trying to do some homework, that's available to see on YouTube. A horrible
Absolutely.
print, but it's still fascinating to watch that one. And then also, now this is one because of his literary roots, has been made multiple times, but Kidnapped, the Robert Louis Stevenson
Right.
film. He was in a version of that.
That was one of his last films, last important films at Fox in about 1938. He was very uncomfortable with that role. He felt he was too old to play Brecht in that film, and he was paired with this very young leading lady, and he was quite uncomfortable with that, although it did get good reviews. Pretty much everything he did got good reviews. I didn't see a lot of bad reviews. There were a few maybe in the early years, but not in his Fox period, his heyday, which was 29 to 1939. That was his heyday years at Fox. And what another interesting fact about him is he started his heyday at the age of 40. I mean, wow. I mean, usually people reach their peak earlier than that.
Would that be in Old Arizona?
That was 1929. Yes, that was the first of his Fox. He won his Fox contract based on that movie.
Oh, excuse me. I forgot to introduce myself. My name is Gonzalo Sebastian Rodrigo Don Juan Chicuelo. But the girls, they call me Conejito. That me little rabbit.
And that also came about as a result of an accident. Incidentally, a very serious one.
Yeah. I wasn't aware at that point. I always thought of him as he was the first Cisco Kid in the movies, but I guess there actually were a couple of silent Cisco Kid films prior to that. Yes,
there were two. Heart of the West was the first one in 2007. It goes way back, almost to the writing of the short story by O. Henry. Cisco Kid is based on an O. Henry story. And then there was another one in 1919 called Border Terror. And what was interesting about those early films is they kept true to the actual story, because in the story, Cisco is a ruthless killer. And of course, in Old Arizona, in the Tom Barry script, he is kind of this happy-go-lucky Robin Hood-like rogue guy.
Tanya, I have not been with a woman, you little silly. I get this perfume from the barber.
So you really smell nice for other girls, eh?
No. I care about nobody but you.
How I can be sure?
I swear, it is only you. Tonya Maria, I would not so much as look at these other women.
You swear?
I swear.
It was a complete change of pace for Baxter, though. So you could write a book about this film. I'm a big booster of it, incidentally, and a lot of people have nothing but bad to say about it. And I defend it, man. I saw that film again just before I wrote the book. And man, I was impressed. This was the first all sound outdoor motion picture. It was a groundbreaker. They had different speakers in the bushes, and they had all kinds of things they were dealing with, and all kinds of barriers, in addition to the story that we can talk about the original director, Raoul Walsh. But yeah, I mean, the film,
wasn't he originally going to star in it?
Yes, he was to be the star and the director. Fox had invented this thing called movie tone. They had invented this sound process. and they wanted to show it off. And Warner Brothers had a couple of sound films, but they wanted to show it off, and they felt that the O. Henry story, it would be great to have a Western and show it off, a complete sound Western. So that's how the original idea came about. And they had young Raoul Walsh, who was a young actor, part-time director. I don't know whether he was actually working for Fox at the time, but he's doing some films for them. I don't know if he was under contract to them. I don't remember. But anyway, they hired him and gave him the assignment. They hired a scriptwriter by the name of Tom Berry, who was very prominent at that time, to write a script. And he came up with a script with Cisco as a, kind of a rogue, pleasant kind of character, kind of a positive kind of character rather than the ruthless killer. And he came up with a script, and Walsh took it, and he went to Utah and began filming scenes of it. And he had filmed a portion of it, and he sent the footage to Fox in Hollywood. And they looked at it. They loved the footage, but there was a funny sound coming from the sound. There was a sound effect. It was a kind of a whirring sound. They couldn't figure out, what is that? And it finally occurred to them, it was the wind that was blowing into those microphones. So anyway, they managed to take care of that, and Walsh started again in the new, whatever they did. He started again, and he did a portion of that movie. He really didn't do the acting part of it. He filmed some of the footage of the scenery and stuff like that they were going to do. I don't believe he did a lot of the acting parts of it yet, but he was taking the footage back to Hollywood. He was taking it by car, and a jackrabbit jumped up on the windshield of the car and broke the windshield. And all that shattered glass went into his eyes. Went into both eyes. He was severely injured, and they managed to take him and save his one eye, but the other one could not be saved. And as you know, if you know Raoul Walsh, who was a great favorite of mine, incidentally, he wore an eye patch for the rest of his life. And of course, it eliminated him from being the Cisco Kid. He could not be the Cisco Kid. And he had to give up the directorial job, which went to Fox contract director Irving Cummings, who did the rest of the film. And of course, they had to find a Cisco Kid. And that was what opened the door to Baxter and major, major stardom, because Baxter, when the film came out, it was a huge success. People loved it. They'd never heard all those sounds. They had never heard the horse's hooves. They had never heard the gunshots. They had never heard these things. It was thrilling to them. And if you put yourself back into that era, and also the movie is quite well put together for its time. They were still feeling their way back in that era, the transition era between silence and sound. They were, everything was experimental back then. But the film is, I think, I went back and looked at it, and I thought, boy, I bought into this meme that it wasn't any good originally. And then I watched it again. And wow, the ending is incredible. I mean, you got to see the ending. It will surprise you. It will be like an O. Henry ending, except it wasn't O. Henry's. It was O. Henry's character, but it wasn't his ending. But wow, it's not what you expect, for sure.
Yeah, I need to rewatch it. It's just been too long.
You really knew. And as I say to people, because people are always asking me about this particular picture, make up your own mind about the film. Don't take my word for it. Don't take somebody else's word for it. It's on YouTube, so you can watch it for free.
Yeah.
So
do you know if any footage with Raoul Walsh is included in the final film? Maybe some long shots or something?
It could be, I never looked for that. It could very well be. I don't know. It could, because they used a lot of his footage. Now, Irving Cummings got the directorial credits, which didn't seem entirely fair to me, but anyway, Baxter won an Oscar for his performance. People were stunned by it. Yeah. They hadn't seen him like that before. And they were, it was a huge success. It led to his Fox contract, which was a huge deal. Baxter was ready. He was often discouraged throughout his career. He went through highs and lows, and he was often discouraged. And he would feel like, well, maybe this is my last film. And this one really rescued what he was feeling at the time anyway, whether he would have quit the business. He was on the verge of quitting, and it gave him great notoriety. It made him a top star at the age of 40. And he's stayed a top star until 1939, really, when he left Fox.
Yeah. Well, he returned to the role a couple of times later on, too.
Right. He did a film called The Cisco Kid. And also, he did a film called Arizona Kid, too, which was Cisco, but Fox Film Corporation didn't have the rights to the Cisco Kid character. It had run out or whatever, and they needed to reacquire. So they made the Cisco Kid into the Arizona Kid. The Arizona Kid is an interesting film because it co-starred him with Carol Lombard, of all people. Interesting. But yeah, he made the return of the Cisco Kid in 1939, his last year at Fox, too.
Yeah. And as I recall, that one has Cesar Romero in it, who would take over the role of Cisco Kid for a series of films.
That was a hit at Baxter. I think it was a hit at Baxter's psyche, too. The fact that they brought the characters on to take his place, because he liked Cisco Kid was his favorite role. That was his favorite, interestingly. You wouldn't have thought so, but it was his favorite role of all the ones he played. And they brought those guys on. He later learned that they were brought on to take his place. And of course, Romero took his place in a bunch of B movies. But
well, of course, somewhere in here, we've got to talk about 42nd Street.
Absolutely.
Out in Hollywood, the sensation of the moment is the picture called 42nd Street, into which Warner Brothers have put stars, girls, beauty, and talent in lavish quantities. 42nd Street is a story within a story, a show within a show, a backstage drama of kicking heels, smiling faces, and heavy hearts. It reveals the drama behind the production of a big Broadway musical, from the rehearsals to the grand finale. To bring this tremendous production to the screen, they've used 10 famous stars, including Veed Daniels, Warner Baxter, Ruby Keeler, George Brent, Dick Powell, Ginger Rogers, Una Merkel, Guy Kibbe, George E. Stone, Alan Jenkins, Lyle Talbot. 200 beautiful girls were picked from more than 5,000 applicants for work in these amazing chorus ensembles. Luxurious settings, spectacular dance routines, set to the rhythm of inspiring music, in scenes never before attempted on stage or screen.
That's one of those titles that people who know Warner Baxter at all, that's one that's going to come to mind.
His most famous role, Julian Marsh, stage producer, stage director in 42nd Street, one of the great musical motion pictures. Again, the book covers that in great detail. There's a lot of background about the making of that picture and Busby Berkeley and all the lavish kind of things. Warner Brothers could be very tight, but boy, they let Berkeley do his thing. They really did, and they deserve a lot of credit. Warner Brothers is my favorite studio. I just think they were great. But they let Berkeley do what he wanted to do, and they had a great cast of their regulars, but they brought Baxter over from Fox. That was a great break from him, and it came at another low period where he was feeling really down in the dumps about his career at Fox. Fox was not known for their great stories until Zanuck took over. And then when he took over, the whole studio changed. And they began to get good projects because he was a brilliant filmmaker. With all his faults, he was also a brilliant filmmaker.
But and then, anyway, of course, that film gave Baxter his, I guess it would be his most famous line of any he ever delivered.
Yes.
Sawyer, you listen to me. And you listen hard. 200 people, 200 jobs, $200,000, 5 weeks of grind and blood and sweat depend upon you. It's the lives of all these people who've worked with you. You've got to go on. You've got to give and give and give. They've got to like you. Got to. Do you understand? You can't fall down. You can't, because Your future's in it. My future and everything all of us have is staked on you. All right, now I'm through. But you keep your feet on the ground and your head on those shoulders of yours and go out and Sawyer. You're going out a youngster. But you've got to come back a star.
Now, there's so much we could get into, and clearly not enough time to do so. Prisoner of Shark Island was an interesting, and apparently was another high point. I want to talk about, you mentioned this earlier. I guess the sense I got was that he sort of had a fragile psyche. I'm wondering if what he suffered from might be what we now think of as bipolar. But there's
again,
such
it was not diagnosed back then, but
right.
That was, mental illness was not totally understood.
Yeah. It just fascinated me that on one hand, he had so many hobbies that you talk about in there, things that, he would enjoy doing. And he obviously enjoyed traveling, and he was devoted to his wife, his second wife. And yet that was balanced with this tension and pressure and self-doubt regarding his career.
And he explained it by saying it was pressures of the acting in films, and you're always as good as your last film. And I think that was part of it. I really do think, because he started old, he was kind of old to be a top star, 40. We don't think of that as old today, but back then it was kind of, late in the game, although he had been making films for about 10 years when he got in old Arizona. But he felt a lot of pressure. And I really do believe, again, that was part of it, but I believe his circumstances and his coming from nothing. He was very poor for his early life, and all these unfortunate things that kept happening. His wife's dad was killed in a train accident. He was in a train derailment, and all these things would bound to be, if it were happening to me, I would think, my God, what's going to happen next? Where is this going? The worst one was the aerial accident during the Such Men Are Dangerous. And that was the most serious accident ever in films at that time. They had to do these aerial scenes for this film. There was 3 planes that took off from California coast. Baxter in the first plane with a stunt double and a couple other people. And then the last planes was a cinematographer, and they were going to do these difficult stunts. And one plane was the director. And after they had been out for a time and they began to maneuver into place to do these stunts, the planes got too close to one another and they became entangled. And both the back planes went down in flames. And it wiped out the director, the cinematographer, some of the major players on the film. Baxter watched that from the first plane.
Right.
And he was to take part in all of this stuff. It had to be a stunner.
Yeah.
It would have affected me.
And one thing that impressed me, in spite of all these things and the emotional and the psychological issues that he had and everything, his reputation. He was seen as this upstanding gentleman. And the phrase actually came into my head before I saw you quote Hedda Hopper referring to him as a regular guy.
Say, Margaret, there's a full moon out tonight. Let's go out and sit under it, will you? All night, huh? For 2 nights? For a week? What do you say?
What's eating you?
Oh, bugs, I guess. Same old bugs.
Father would have a royal fit if we didn't show up. You know we've got to go.
Oh, hang the meeting. Suppose we don't go. What difference is it going to make? Your father will do all the talking anyway. We'll sit there with our heads on a hinge. Yes, JL. Of course, JL. That seems fair, Joe. I got a chronic pain in my neck, Margaret, from just nodding.
Don't be a fool, Dan Brooks.
Say, I'll tell you what. Let's stand in front of the house and throw rocks at the meeting, will you?
You do think of the cutest things.
So It just seems like he was a fundamentally decent guy.
He was. He was. And everybody, including all the people that I found quotes from, he worked with a lot of interesting people. And they all said the same thing. He was a genuinely nice person. He was thoughtful. He was kind. He was always doing favors. Myrna Loy worked with him 4 times. And she, in her memoirs, talked about him a couple different times. And she said he would always do her favors. If she wanted to take a day off, he would come in and do scenes in her place or whatever they could do, work around her. She had nothing but kind words and also praised his acting. But this was said by a number of other people as well. And some people who were not necessarily fans of him, he won over. The director Tay Garnett, who he worked with on a film called Slave Ship, which is a really interesting movie too. He had wanted Clark Gable for one of the two major roles. They had borrowed Wallace Beery from one of the slavers in this, and they had wanted Clark Gable, and Clark Gable was not available, and Jim wouldn't let him go. And so they had to settle for Warner Baxter, and he was not happy about it. He says this very candidly in his memoirs. But Baxter won him over. He said he was an excellent actor. He thought he was good, and he was a good man. So
yeah. So we come to, and we've skipped over a lot of stuff, but hey, that's why we're steering you towards getting Dan's book, so you can read all the good stuff in between that we don't have time to cover here. But I do want to cover the Crime Doctor series because I have had a certain fascination with that. I've been watching them. I haven't made it through all of them yet, unfortunately. I did just finish the Millerson case, which is like Crime Doctor out west. I mean,
I know. Yeah, it was kind of a crazy. That was kind of a crazy one. Critics liked it though. That's my least favorite, I think, of the Crime Doctor films. But go ahead.
But it was a role that it was interesting. I mean, of course, the origin is in radio on that one. As I mean, you mentioned earlier, you talked about your book, The Whistler, and of course, that was based on a popular radio series. Well, here comes another one, another Columbia series based on a popular radio show, Crime Doctor.
What is your field, Dr. Ordway? Are you a surgeon?
No, I'm a psychiatrist.
Oh, then we have something in common. The study of the human mind is a subject of absorbing interest to me.
Oh, are you a student of psychology?
One has to be in my profession. You see, I'm an actor.
He gets into that one, and I just find a certain irony that he ends up being a psychologist.
Absolutely.
And in real life, he has these issues he's wrestling with.
I find that too. I agree. Isn't that interesting? And he knew a lot about it because, he again was not candid about the treatment that he sought for his problems. But he was a very wealthy person. And so I assume he had the best treatment that he could find for his problems, because he had two. In 1939, after he lost his contract, Warner Baxter's whole self-image, for some reason, he, again, as you said, he had all these hobbies that he loved to do. They were all interesting to him. He was interested in politics and all this stuff. And, he had a wife that was totally devoted to him. He had a mother. His mother was still alive, and she was totally devoted to him. His friends and family had enormous respect for him, and they kept all his secrets secret. That's another interesting aspect. Yeah. But yet his psyche was tied up in his career. And when that inevitably declined, as all the great stars, their careers decline after a time as they get older. So few keep their fame throughout their whole life. But, he had to know this was coming, and he was dreading it. But when that happened, it threw him off into his first depression. And then the second one, he called it a nervous breakdown. I tried to explore the term nervous breakdown in the book. But then in 1941, he had done 2 more films in the interim. He didn't quit acting. He owed Fox a film, and then he did a film called Adam Had 4 Sons for Columbia. And after that one was completed, he went into a second, more serious nervous breakdown. He was completely out of it for several months. He said, I would try to do something and I'd forget what I was doing. And he was just kind of out of it. And he announced his retirement from filmmaking. And that lasted until his recovery. And then he realized, after he was able to recover, that he wanted to act. It's the only really thing he ever knew. And he loved it. And he announced that he wanted to come back. And among the first calls, in fact, the first call he got was from an admirer of his. And that was the notorious Harry Cohn at Columbia. Cohn was a huge fan. He had worked with Baxter before, and Broadway Bill and some of the other films. Adam Had 4 Sons as well. And he had envisioned the series from the Crime Doctor radio program. He felt that Warner Baxter would be the perfect choice to play the title role. And he wanted him enough to agree to the terms, because Baxter wanted a good salary, and he wanted to make only 2 films per year with an interim in between. So he would have time to do his stuff that he liked to do.
Yeah.
So it would calm everything down. There would be no pressure. And the Crime Doctor, he signed the contract. The Crime Doctor ended up being a godsend for him because he had very little pressure. And all of the people that worked on that series held him in high regard and treated him. Unlike some of the Fox, he wasn't always treated that great, even though Zanuck was a brilliant filmmaker. Zanuck was a micromanager, and he was involved in every detail of his contract players' careers. He was involved in every detail of the films that he put together. And Baxter said he couldn't do anything without asking Zanuck's permission. And he felt he had been in the business so long and had achieved a level of success that he shouldn't have had to ask. But anyway, Cohn treated him entirely different. And so that was the beginning of the Crime Doctor films. And they went from 1944 through 49. There were 10 in all. And they kind of covered a broad range of topics. Their B movies were made very cheaply. They were made to fill the bottom half of a movie double bill. They were made very cheaply, very quickly. Some of the movies, the Crime Doctor films, were made in like 10 days. Can you imagine?
Yeah. I mean, the thing that I like about it, and I guess maybe we should just do a quick synopsis here, because we talked about the Crime Doctor series in a previous podcast just briefly, but to recap, it starts off with Warner Baxter character being, I guess he's been shot. He's thrown out of a car.
Right.
He has amnesia. He comes to in a hospital, doesn't know who he is. He's attended by a physician, actually Ray Collins, who was the original Crime Doctor on radio. I learned that from your book.
Yeah.
And he becomes so grateful for his care, he aspires to become a medical doctor himself, which he does, and then he ends up specializing.
And he was a master criminal.
Yeah. So the first film involves him getting clues as to his past life and ending up, spoiler alert, but hey.
It was a setup.
Yeah. Bringing his former gang to justice. And then from there, he goes on to other adventures. But a lot of them, they have a real noir feel to them, I think.
They do.
Several of them. And I think the two that I've found most interesting, the second one, Crime Doctor's Strangest Case, which has Lloyd Bridges in a really unusual role. I like that one. And there's also, and now I don't remember the title of this one, but there's one where, because of circumstances, the Crime Doctor himself inadvertently kills someone as part of a murder plot.
Yes.
And that's, he's not guilty. Nobody blames him for it because they realize that he was set up, but it's a fascinating story. And then Crime Doctor's Manhunt, I thought was interesting.
That was an interesting one too.
Because the resolution of that, his final speech just reminds me of one that Simon Oakland would make several years later in Hitchcock's Psycho.
That's interesting. Yeah, I thought those were among the best. If you haven't seen Shadows in the Night, you need to see that one.
I've seen that one. I've seen them chronologically. So I think I thought
that was a really interesting.
I think it
was an atmospheric kind of thing. I'm introducing that this coming weekend at the Columbus Moving Picture Show. Shadows in the Night was an interesting film. I'm glad they picked that one because I happen to have interviewed a couple of people who appeared in that film. One that you brought up just before dawn was the one where he kills somebody.
Okay.
And I thought that was a very interesting one as well.
Yeah.
And incidentally, you know who directed some of those?
Oh, well, yeah, that's the thing I was going to say. Several in that series were directed by William Castle.
Yeah. And William Castle, he was a master. I'm a defender of William Castle. People say, well, he was a schlockmeister and all this stuff. Yeah. Well, he was a promoter for sure.
Yeah,
for sure. A charming kind of roguish guy that was a promoter. But man, he knew how to make B movies.
Yeah.
And these movies, he made the most. They had skeletal scripts, and he made the most of these old films. And he took what he had and made scares and all kinds of things. And he was quite an excellent B movie director. And he did all genres. He didn't do just sort of the atmospheric mystery kind of horror things. He did all kinds. He did westerns and adventures and all that stuff.
Yeah.
So,
all right. Well, gosh, again, any of this that we've talked about could be easily expanded to another 15, 20 minutes, half an hour, whatever. Lots of interesting material here in your book. Once again, the book is The Accidental Star, The Life and Films of Warner Baxter, by my guest, Dan Van Neste. And Dan, that brings us to the question that I ask all of my guests, and that is, what is your most memorable movie-going experience?
I think I have multiple, actually. I think
it's not uncommon. I'm shooting for the best. What can I say?
Early on in my life, I think I discovered classic movies on television. So, we lived in the country and there was like 2 stations. You were adjusting the antenna all the time, trying to see the whole film. But yeah, I mean, the adventure, horror, mystery films of the old classic era ones were my favorites. But the first actual theater going experience that I remember is my mom took us to Disney's Swiss Family Robinson. And I remember loving that film, all about it. It was just something that I liked, adventure films like that. And so it was right up my alley. So I really enjoyed that. And then later she took us to see some other ones, the Disney ones, and Gone with the Wind. I remember that. And that was thrilling on the big screen. It's huge accomplishment.
Yeah.
So those would be it, I guess.
Okay. Fair enough. Yeah. There's nothing like that first big one that's going to stand out in your memory. Well, Dan, it's been a real pleasure. And
my
I want
pleasure.
to thank you for joining me on Movie Nights and Matinees.
I appreciate the opportunity and thank you. Take care.
As usual, you can visit the Movie Nights and Matinees website's bookshelf page to find an Amazon link if you want to get yourself a copy of Dan's book. On the screening room page, you'll find a select list of available movies featuring Warner Baxter. If you haven't already done so, remember to click on the follow, subscribe, or download button wherever you listen, and where possible, leave a rating and/or a review. Also, be sure to swing by the podcast's Facebook page, where you'll tend to find a little bonus material related to various episodes, and it also provides you with a good place to ask questions, make suggestions, or otherwise share your thoughts about the podcast or its topics. I hope you enjoyed episode 32. My vacation threw the schedule off a bit, but watch for episode 33, which will feature another Oscar winner, but with a more international flavor.
なんだこいつはゴジラってやつじゃなんだそれ島のやつがそう言ってたんだ今日みたいに深海魚が撃つ時は